The compliance ledger for case 9914 GC was supposed to be 3 pages, 31 lines of summary, a bureaucratic formality confirming that Terran delegation contributions to the Galactic Council's Joint Development Fund had been assessed, catalogued, and archived in accordance with Article 88 of the Council's founding compact. It should have taken Dara Kessler 20 minutes. It took her 4 years. She was not supposed to find anything. That was the entire point of her position: human female, administrative grade 4, attached records clerk, Office of Archival Compliance, Central Secretariat of the Galactic Council. The title was longer than most of the documents she processed. She had been hired 18 months into the Council's Terran integration period, a structured decade of provisional membership during which humanity held observer status, limited voting rights, and access to exactly 1 floor of the Secretariat's archive wing. Her clearance was low. Her office was small. Her desk sat in a windowless alcove on the administrative level, wedged between the climatregulation ductwork and a storage closet that had been converted into a filing annex sometime in the previous century, and still smelled faintly of the adhesive compounds the Tavrathi used to bind their ceremonial scrolls. Dara was 36 years old, average height, light brown skin, her dark curly hair pulled back with a plain clip that she replaced every few weeks when the spring gave out. She wore the same rotation of 3 dark blazers over neutral blouses, flat shoes, no jewelry except a watch her father had given her when she graduated from the University of Brasilia's School of Public Administration. She had studied intergovernmental compliance frameworks. She had worked 2 years in a municipal audit office before that, checking procurement records for a mid-sized city government, a job that had taught her 2 things: that every institution believed its own bookkeeping, and that the bookkeeping was almost never as clean as the institution believed. She had written her thesis on audit methodology in federated systems. She had applied to the Council Secretariat because the posting appeared on a government employment board 3 days before the deadline, and because the salary was enough to send money home to her mother in Recife and still afford single-occupancy quarters on the station. She had not applied to change anything. She had applied to do a job. The Galactic Council's Central Secretariat occupied a vast orbital complex above the planet Ethis, a temperate world chosen 2,000 years ago as the Council's permanent seat, because it was equidistant from the 5 founding species' home systems, and because its atmosphere was tolerable, if not comfortable, to all of them. The complex was a cathedral of governance, soaring atriums of pale stone and brushed alloy, curved corridors wide enough to accommodate species ranging from the compact, gray-skinned Tavrathi to the towering, 4-armed Disari glass domes overhead, admitting broad panels of daylight from the Ethis sun, holographic schedule boards glowing in cyan script along every wall, 12,000 staff, 400 committee rooms, 96 permanent committees, ranging from the Committee on Interspecies Medical Standards to the Committee on Atmospheric Calibration for Multi-Species Habitation, each with its own staff, budget, and filing system. A plenary chamber that seated 6,000 delegates under a dome so large that weather formed inside it on humid days. Dara's corner of it was quiet. The Office of Archival Compliance occupied a suite of rooms on the administrative level that most delegates did not know existed. Its staff of 1917 Tavrathi, 1 Disari and Dara, processed an average of 400 compliance reviews per fiscal quarter. Each review verified that a member species recorded contributions to council funds matched the official archive entry. The process was straightforward on paper. Pull the archive entry, pull the source documentation, compare figures, note discrepancies, issue corrections. In practice, each review required navigating a documentation ecosystem that had been growing for 2 millennia, layered, cross-referenced, stored across multiple database architectures, and maintained by 17 Tavrathi clerks who had been doing the work long before Dara arrived and would be doing it long after she left. Discrepancies were flagged. Corrections were issued. The work was methodical, repetitive, and invisible. Nobody in the plenary chamber had ever mentioned the Office of Archival Compliance in a floor speech. Nobody ever would. Dara was good at it. She learned the Tavrathi filing system, which organized documents not by date or subject, but by a concept roughly translatable as weight of consequence. A nested hierarchy that placed treaties above trade agreements above personnel records, and personnel records above everything except medical files, which occupied their own parallel structure for reasons the Tavrathi considered self-evident and Dara found impenetrable for the first 6 months. She learned the archive's retrieval codes. She learned which database nodes responded quickly and which required a formal access request routed through the IT division, a process that took between 3 days and 3 weeks, depending on the disposition of the duty officer. She learned to read Tavrathi script well enough to verify citation chains without running every entry through the translation matrix, which introduced rounding errors in financial figures that the Tavrathi found unacceptable. Her supervisor was a Tavrathi named Lace, a quiet, meticulous individual with smooth gray skin, deep-set dark eyes, and the compressed posture of someone who had spent 4 decades processing documents and found the work neither satisfying nor dissatisfying but simply correct. Lace reviewed Dara's output weekly, noted errors in a ledger kept on actual paper. The Tavrathi did not trust digital-only record-keeping, and occasionally offered commentary in the form of single sentences delivered without inflection. Your citation chain for the Distari Agricultural Fund is missing a secondary source. The Keith Ronnie delegation's contribution figure has been transposed. Correct it before filing. You have improved. That last one came 8 months in. Dara took it as the highest compliment she was likely to receive from any Tavrathi in any context for the foreseeable future. For the first 2 years, the work was exactly what it appeared to be. She processed reviews. She verified numbers. She flagged discrepancies, usually minor transposition errors, occasionally a contribution logged to the wrong fiscal quarter. The corrections were issued. The archive was updated. The system functioned. Dara developed a rhythm. Arrive at 07:30, process reviews until the midday break, eat a commissary stew at her desk because the staff dining hall was 3 floors up and the lift was slow, process reviews until 17:00, walk to her quarters, eat again, read case law or charter provisions for an hour, sleep. She did this 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year. She did not find it unpleasant. She found it legible. She found it honest, in a way that her previous work on Earth had not been. The council system was older, more complex, and more precisely documented than any human institution she had encountered, and there was something reassuring about a filing hierarchy that had been refined over centuries to produce the same result regardless of who operated it. The numbers either matched or they did not. The citation chains either held or they did not. There was a clarity to the work that appealed to the part of her that had written a thesis on audit methodology and meant every word of it. Case 9914 GC arrived on her desk on a Tuesday morning in her 3rd year, a routine compliance check on Terran contributions to the Joint Development Fund for the current fiscal quarter. She opened the file. She pulled the official archive entry. She cross-referenced the Terran delegation's submitted payment records against the Secretariat's logged receipt. The numbers did not match. Not dramatically, not in the way that suggested a clerical error or a transposition. The Terran delegation's records showed a contribution of 4.7 million standard credits to the Joint Development Fund. The Secretariat's archive entry listed 2.1 million. The difference was 2.6 million credits, a sum large enough to fund the Council's entire emergency medical reserve for a standard quarter. Dara flagged it. She routed the discrepancy to Lace with a standard correction request. Lace reviewed it, noted the flag, and forwarded it to the Archive Verification Division for reconciliation. This was the correct process. Dara had followed it precisely. The reconciliation came back in 6 days. The Archive Verification Division reported that the discrepancy had been investigated and resolved. The correct figure was 2.1 million credits. The Terran delegation's records contained an error. No correction to the archive was required. Dara read the reconciliation report twice. She read it a third time. She noted that the report did not reference the banking confirmation code she had included in her flag. She noted that its conclusion was worded identically to a template used for minor transposition corrections, boilerplate applied to cases where a digit had been entered wrong. She noted that the report bore no analyst's name. She pulled the source documentation, the actual payment transfer records, the banking confirmation codes, the allocation receipts signed by both the Terran financial attaché and the Council's receiving officer. The source documents confirmed 4.7 million. She flagged it again. Attached every source document. Routed it through the same channel with a notation that the reconciliation appeared based on the archive entry rather than the primary sources, and that the primary sources contradicted the archive figure. The second reconciliation took 9 days. Same conclusion. Correct figure, 2.1 million. A handwritten annotation in Tavrathi script, appended by someone whose name was redacted. The matter is resolved. No further review is warranted. Dara sat at her desk for a long time. The climate duct hummed. The filing annex smelled of old adhesive. Her watch ticked an analog movement, counting seconds whether or not anyone was listening. She was not angry, not yet. She was confused in a way that felt structural, as though the floor she had been standing on for 2 years had shifted by a degree she could measure but not explain. The system had told her that a number she could verify with primary documentation was wrong, and that she should stop asking. She did not stop. She pulled the Terran contribution records for the previous quarter, then the quarter before that, then the full fiscal year, then the 3 fiscal years before her arrival. She worked after hours, staying at her desk long after the Tavrathi staff filed out in their quiet procession, always at exactly 17:15, their departure as precise as their filing. She ate at her desk. Ration packets from the commissary, always the same vegetable stew because it was the cheapest option, and she was sending money home. She requisitioned archive access for historical Terran contribution records going back to the start of the integration period. The access request was denied. Standard grounds. The records predated her employment and fell outside the scope of an active compliance review. She filed an appeal, citing the Secretariat's procedural manual, Section 14, which granted compliance staff access to historical records when a current review identified a pattern requiring longitudinal verification. Denied, same grounds. No explanation for why Section 14 did not apply. She filed a second appeal. Denied, a third, denied. She documented each denial, noting the date, the reviewing officer's name, and the ground cited. The fourth appeal, routed to a different administrator, a Keithrani deputy archivist who processed requests on a rotating cycle and had a tendency to approve those with correctly formatted citations, was approved 6 weeks after the initial request. The approval granted access to records specifically cited in Case 9914 GC and no others. Dara used that narrow window. She pulled 7 years of Terran contribution records and worked through them 1 quarter at a time. Each verification chain required tracing a contribution through 6 to 8 linked documents across different archive nodes, different categorization codes, different secretariat divisions. Each chain took between 40 minutes and 3 hours. There were 112 chains for 7 years of quarterly contributions, across 4 fund categories. She completed them all. The work consumed her evenings, her weekends, her annual leave allocation, 12 days she had been saving for a trip to Recife that she quietly canceled by message to her mother, explaining only that work was busy. Her mother replied with a single line, "Be careful with yourself." Dara read the message, closed it, and opened the next quarterly record. She developed a system. Each evening after the office emptied, she would pull a set of records, run the verification chains, log the results in her personal ledger, and save the work to all 3 locations before leaving. She kept a handwritten log of her progress, paper, like Lace used, because paper could not be remotely accessed, could not be deleted by an administrator with terminal privileges, and could not be altered without physical evidence. She filled 11 notebooks over the course of the investigation. She kept them in a locked drawer in her quarters, beneath a stack of clean blouses. The pattern was not subtle. It was not subtle at all once you had enough data points, but finding it required the patience to follow each chain to its end, and the institutional literacy to know which nodes to query and which cross-references to pull. Dara had both. She had spent 2 years acquiring them in a windowless alcove, processing 400 reviews a quarter, learning a filing system organized by a concept she still could not fully translate. Terran contributions to the Joint Development Fund had been systematically reduced in the official archive. Every quarter, for 7 years, the reductions ranged from 12% to 61% of the actual amounts. The missing funds totaled approximately 94 million standard credits. The money had not vanished. It had been allocated. The reallocation was not crude. It was not a simple deletion or a round number substitution that might catch a casual auditor's eye. Each quarterly adjustment was calibrated differently. Some quarters showed reductions of 12%. Others showed 40. Showed 61. The variance itself was part of the design. A consistent percentage would have created a detectable pattern in any automated review. The staggered percentages mimicked the kind of organic fluctuation that legitimate redistribution would produce. Someone had thought carefully about how to make this invisible, but under headings that did not reference the Terran delegation. Disari infrastructure grants, Tavrathi cultural preservation funds, Keith Rani agricultural subsidies. Emergency allocations to 3 species whose home systems had experienced resource shortfalls. Legitimate expenses, every one. Real needs funded with real money. Money that humanity had contributed and that the official record said humanity had not. The effect was precise. On paper, humanity appeared to be the Council's least generous member, the species that paid the minimum. One widely cited analytical report, authored by the Office of Strategic Assessment using archive data, had described Terran commitment as adequate but uninspired. That phrase had appeared in 14 subsequent policy documents. It had been quoted on the plenary floor 6 times. It had become, through repetition, a fact the kind that did not require re-examination, because everyone who cited it assumed someone else had already verified it. Nobody had. Not until case 9914 GC landed on Dara's desk by routine rotation. She showed the preliminary results to Lace. Not the full analysis, just the first quarter's discrepancy, presented as a follow-up to the original flag. Lace looked at the numbers. She looked at the source documents. She looked at Dara. Her dark eyes held an expression Dara had not seen before, something in the narrow space between recognition and refusal. Her compressed posture shifted, tightened, settled. "Continue your regular duties, Clerk Kessler," Lace said. Her voice was flat, but her hands were not folded in the gesture of routine dismissal. They were pressed flat against her paper ledger, as though holding something down. Dara understood. Lace had seen enough to know, not enough to act, but enough to not tell Dara to stop. She told no one else. Not because she was afraid, though she would learn to be afraid later, when the scope of what she had found became clear and the institution's immune response activated. She told no one because she was a compliance clerk, and compliance clerks verified numbers. She had found numbers that did not verify. The correct response, according to every procedure she had been trained on, was to document the discrepancy, assemble the evidence, and present it through the proper channels. She had already tried the proper channels. They had not worked, so she would build something the channels could not absorb. She spent 4 months assembling a cross-referenced ledger, a single document that traced every Terran contribution from its point of origin through the banking system, through the council's receiving office, and into the archive, noting the exact point at which each figure changed. She verified each entry against primary sources. She obtained copies of the original allocation orders that had redirected the missing funds, tracking them through the Secretariat's internal financial routing system. She documented the authorization codes. Every order bore the approval signature of the same office, the Division of Financial Reconciliation, reporting directly to the Council's Senior Administrative Committee. The committee was chaired by a Tavrathi named Pren. Everyone in the Secretariat knew who Pren was. Senior Administrator Pren had served on the Council's administrative staff for 47 years. She had overseen the integration period frameworks for the last 3 admitted species, including humanity. She was frequently described as the architect of modern council administration. Her portrait hung in the main corridor of the administrative level, a formal holographic rendering showing her in senior staff robes, gray skin smooth, dark eyes steady, 4-fingered hands folded in the Tavrathi gesture of institutional confidence. Dara walked past that portrait every morning on her way to her desk. She completed the ledger, formatted it per the Secretariat's evidentiary guidelines, saved 3 copies her office terminal, a personal data chip in her quarters, and a secure external node on the Ethai's orbital ring. Then she requested a meeting with Senior Administrator Pren. The meeting was scheduled 14 days later, standard wait time. Pren's office was large, bright, with a curved window overlooking the main atrium. Daylight pooled on the pale stone floor. Pren sat behind a wide desk of polished imported wood, actual wood, a material so rare on the complex that its presence was a statement about seniority. She looked at Dara with patient, measured tolerance. Dara sat. She placed the ledger on the desk. She explained what she had found. 4 minutes. No editorializing. Numbers, source, documentation, discrepancy pattern, authorization trail. She placed the data chip beside the ledger and waited. Pren did not touch either one, hands flat on the desk. "You have done thorough work, Clerk Kessler. This matter has been reviewed. The allocation adjustments are consistent with standard redistribution protocols. The archive reflects final allocated figures, not gross contributions. The archive labels them as contributions, not allocations. The entry headings read Member Contribution to Joint Development Fund. 3 resolutions criticizing Terran commitment levels cited archive data. The data is wrong." Pren picked up the ledger, turned 3 pages, closed it. "Your diligence is noted. I will refer this to the appropriate review body. Observe standard confidentiality protocols." Dara walked back to her alcove. The ledger would be reviewed by the body that had already closed it twice. A notation would go in her file. The process had done what it was designed to do. That night in her quarters, Dara sat on the edge of her bunk and held her father's watch in both hands. She turned it over. The back was engraved with a date, her graduation, and a single line in Portuguese that translated roughly as "the work is the answer." Her father had been a municipal auditor in Recife for 31 years. He had never uncovered a conspiracy. He had never changed a system. He had caught transposition errors, corrected filing mistakes, and ensured that the city's accounts reflected reality. He had believed, with the steady conviction of a man who worked with numbers, That accuracy was not a means to an end but the end itself. That if the numbers were right, the decisions built on them had a chance of being right. And if the numbers were wrong, nothing built on them could stand. Dara put the watch back on her wrist. She opened her terminal. She began expanding the ledger. The next 8 months were the hardest. Not because the work was difficult, the work was the same as it had always been. Verification chains and cross-references and source documents, but because she was now doing it in a space where she understood that the system did not want the work done. Every denied access request was a boundary drawn by people who knew what the records contained. Every boilerplate reconciliation was a message. Stop looking. Every week that passed brought the integration review closer, and with it, the formal assessment that would use the wrong numbers to strip humanity of the standing it had earned and paid for. She developed a protocol for the nights when the scope of it pressed in on her. She would close whatever file she was working on, walk to the commissary always empty after 22:00, buy a stew, bring it back to her desk, and eat it slowly while reading a section of the charter that had nothing to do with financial records. Contract law, diplomatic immunity provisions, the rules governing the maintenance of the station's atmospheric systems. Anything procedural, anything structured, anything that reminded her that the system was not entirely broken, that beneath the corrupted layer, the foundation was still there, built by people who had understood what she understood, that the numbers mattered. She did not route the ledger through official channels again. Instead, she kept working, quietly, methodically. In the hours between her regular duties and the empty quarters where she ate her stew and slept 5 hours and returned to her desk, she expanded the ledger backward not 7 years but 12, the full integration period. She expanded it laterally, not just the Joint Development Fund but every category of Terran contribution. Infrastructure levies, emergency response assessments, scientific cooperation fees, cultural exchange funding, peacekeeping assessments, disaster relief contributions, medical research allocations. Each new category required new access requests. Some were approved, many were denied. For the denied ones, Dara found alternatives: public-facing financial summaries containing enough detail to cross-reference against banking records, committee reports quoting contribution totals in footnotes, annual reviews listing member assessments in appendices most readers skipped. She assembled the picture from fragments, the way an archaeologist pieces together a mosaic from scattered tiles, each piece small, each verifiable, the full image visible only when you stepped back far enough. She lost weight. She did not notice until one of her blazers no longer fit properly across the shoulders. She was eating 1 meal a day most days, the commissary stew, which she had long since stopped tasting, and sometimes forgetting even that when a citation chain led somewhere unexpected and she lost track of the hour. Her Tavrathi colleagues noticed the change. They did not comment on it. The Tavrathi did not comment on personal matters, but Lace began leaving a sealed ration packet on Dara's desk on evenings when the office emptied at 17:15 and Dara did not leave. The packets appeared without explanation, placed precisely at the corner of the desk where Dara's hand would find them when she reached for the next file. They were always the vegetable stew. She read the council's charter, all 11,000 pages of it in sections, during the early morning hours before her shift. She was looking for the mechanisms the founders had built into the system for exactly this kind of situation: the failsafes, the override authorities, the powers that existed on paper because someone, centuries ago, had understood that institutions could be corrupted from within and had written the remedy into the foundation. She found Article 112 in her 9th week of reading, buried in a subsection of the chapter on oversight bodies. She read it 4 times. Then she set it aside and continued reading, because she needed to understand not just what Article 112 permitted, but what it could not be used to prevent. The pattern held in every category. Terran contributions had been systematically reduced. The difference redistributed through the same division of financial reconciliation, authorized by the same committee. The total, across all categories, across 12 years, was 340 million standard credits. Credits that had funded medical programs on 3 worlds, infrastructure on 7, emergency relief during the Keith Ronnie famine, scientific stations in the outer systems, peacekeeping forces along the Disari-Davrathi corridor. Credits that had built things and helped people, and the official record attributed none of it to humanity. She added a new section tracing the downstream effects, analytical reports citing false figures, plenary speeches referencing those reports, 7 formal resolutions criticizing humanity's commitment, policy papers recommending a membership downgrade at the upcoming integration review, citing persistent undercontribution. The integration review was 6 months away. If it proceeded with current data, humanity would lose voting rights, committee seats, and most of its delegation staff. 12 years of real contributions would be erased from institutional memory. No one would call it a betrayal. They would call it a data-driven assessment. She finished the expanded ledger on a Thursday evening, 214 pages, cross-referenced, source-verified. She sat in the empty office past midnight, eyes burning, back aching, 3 stew containers stacked at the corner of her desk, 2 she had bought, 1 Lace had left. In the morning, she contacted one person. She did not contact the Terran delegation. She had considered it. The delegation had a legal affairs officer, a woman named Hargrove, whom Dara had met twice at interspecies coordination sessions. Hargrove was competent, direct, and would have understood the significance of 340 million credits in falsified records immediately. But the delegation's communications were monitored by the Secretariat's Security Office, standard practice during the integration period, applied to all provisional member delegations, and Dara could not be confident that the monitoring was passive. If the Secretariat learned that a compliance clerk had passed financial irregularities to the affected delegation before the matter was formally adjudicated, the disclosure would be reframed as espionage rather than compliance. The charges would be different. The penalties would be permanent. She did not contact the press. There were independent correspondents covering council affairs. 3 services maintained bureau offices on Ethai Station, and any one of them would have found the story irresistible. But media attention without institutional process would produce outrage, not correction. The archive would remain unchanged. The integration review would proceed on the same data. The story would burn bright for a news cycle and then be absorbed into the Council's vast digestive system of committees, referrals, and review bodies that produced reports nobody read. Dara had watched that process from her alcove for nearly 4 years. She knew how it ended. She needed a mechanism inside the system that the system could not override. She needed Article 112, and Article 112 required a committee vote. She contacted a Disari named Orthan. Orthan was a junior delegate, tall, 4-armed, dark bronze skin, with the deliberate, slow-blinking manner Disari adopted when processing complex information. He represented his delegation on the Committee for Administrative Transparency, a body that existed because the Charter required it, and met quarterly because the Charter required that, and that had not issued a substantive report in 11 years, because no one had given it anything substantive to report on. She had met him 3 times, once at an orientation session, once in the commissary where they had shared a table because the hall was full, and he had asked, with genuine curiosity, what a human compliance clerk actually did all day. She had described the citation chains, the verification process, the way a single discrepancy could be traced through 8 linked documents across 4 divisions. He had listened with all 4 arms, still a sign of Disari attention she only later learned to recognize, and then he had said something she would remember. The Council's greatest vulnerability is that it believes its own archives. The third time she had met him was when he came to the archive office to request historical records for a transparency committee, project his own supervisor had described, in his hearing, as a useful exercise in institutional ritual. She chose him because he was junior enough to have no investment in the current system. Because the Committee for Administrative Transparency had charter authority, under Article 112, to demand an independent financial audit of any Secretariat record without prior approval from the Administrative Committee, a power that had existed on paper for centuries and had never been exercised. And because he had listened when she described how citation chains worked, and he had understood why it mattered, she sent a message through the station's internal channel. I have a compliance matter that may be relevant to the Committee for Administrative Transparency. Would you be available to review a document? He replied in 2 hours. He was available. They met in his office, slightly larger than her alcove, similarly windowless. She gave him the ledger. He read it, all 214 pages. 2 days, when he finished, he asked her to come back. This is real. Every figure is source verified. 340 million credits. Over 12 years. His 4 arms folded in a complex geometry, upper pair crossed, lower pair flat on the desk. A slow blink. The integration review. 5 months and 3 weeks. If this reaches the plenary through normal channels. It will not. The internal review process absorbs findings like this. Flagged, reviewed, reclassified as resolved, closed. I have been through the cycle twice. The archive figure stands. The analytical reports built on it stand. The policy recommendations built on those stand. The system is functioning exactly as designed. The design is the problem. Orthan was quiet. Article 112, Dara said. The committee votes to invoke. The audit begins. Results enter the plenary record directly, cannot be reclassified, amended, or withdrawn. Article 112 has never been invoked. It has never been needed. The senior administrative committee will resist. The charter gives them no mechanism. It is self-executing. You have read the charter. I have read the charter. He stared at her for a long time. Then he unfolded his upper arms and reached for his terminal. I will brief my committee chair. I know. This will not be popular. Dara thought about the filing annex, the adhesive smell, the portrait of Pren in the corridor, the resolutions that called humanity uncommitted, the numbers behind them that were wrong on purpose. No, it will not. At the door she paused. Orthan, if they ask why a minor oversight committee is invoking a power never used in council history, cite the article number. The charter does not require a reason. His slow blink. You sound like you have done this before. I sound like a compliance clerk. This is what compliance looks like when the system is out of compliance. She walked back to her office. She sat at her desk. She opened the next file in her queue, a routine Keith Ronnie agricultural levy review. The numbers matched. She noted the verification, logged it, and moved on. 3 weeks passed. Dara heard nothing from Orthan. She did not contact him. She had given him the ledger and the argument and the article number. What happened next was his decision, and the decision of 4 other committee members she had never met. She could not influence their vote. She could only do what she had always done: process her queue, verify her numbers, eat her stew, read the charter in the early morning hours, and wait. During those 3 weeks, a resolution was introduced on the plenary floor, the 8th in 4 years, formally requesting that the Integration Review Committee give particular weight to the demonstrated pattern of undercontribution by the Terran delegation. The resolution cited archive data. It cited the adequate but uninspired report from the Office of Strategic Assessment. It was sponsored by a coalition of 12 delegations, including 3 Tavrathi and 2 Keithrani representatives. Dara read the resolution text on the public docket board outside the plenary chamber during her lunch break. She stood in front of the holographic display for 4 minutes, reading the citation chain at the bottom of the resolution, the chain that traced the data back through the analytical report, through the Office of Strategic Assessment, to the archive entries she had spent 4 years proving were wrong. Then she walked back to her desk and opened the next file in her queue. On the 22nd day, Orthan sent her a message. 1 sentence. The chair has read the document and wishes to convene. Dara read the message. She closed it. She finished the compliance review. She was processing a Vethon Cultural Exchange contribution, numbers matching, no discrepancy. She logged it. Then she allowed herself to sit still for 30 seconds with her hands flat on her desk and her eyes closed. 30 seconds, then she opened the next file. The Committee for Administrative Transparency voted to invoke Article 112 on a Tuesday morning. The vote was 4-1. Orthan voted in favor. The committee chair, a Keithrani elder named Savan who had occupied the position for 9 years without wielding its actual authority, voted in favor after reading the ledger twice and sitting in silence for 40 minutes. When he spoke, he said 1 sentence. The numbers are the numbers. 2 junior members from the outer delegations voted in favor after conferring for less than a minute. They had served long enough to know that Savan never voted yes on anything consequential, and if he was voting yes, the evidence was beyond dispute. The dissenting vote came from a Tavrathi member who cited concerns about institutional stability. The audit notice was filed with the Office of the Secretary General at 09:14 station time. What followed was a sequence Dara had predicted almost exactly, down to the timelines, because she had spent 4 years inside the institution and understood its reflexes the way a physician understands a body's the involuntary responses, the instinct to protect, the hierarchy of urgencies. By 09:30, Pren had been informed. By 10:00, the Senior Administrative Committee had convened an emergency session. By 10:45, 3 Tavrathi delegations had requested an emergency plenary briefing on what they called an unprecedented and destabilizing procedural action by a minor oversight body. By 11:00, the Dasari delegation had issued a formal statement of support for the Article 112 invocation. 2 Keithrani Outer System representatives did the same. The Vethon delegation, which rarely commented on administrative matters, released a 1-line statement requesting full transparency regarding member contribution records. A Dasari News correspondent filed the first external report at 11:20, and by noon the story had reached 3 independent press services covering council affairs for the broader galactic network. By noon, Dara had been summoned. Not to a meeting, to a formal disciplinary proceeding. The Senior Administrative Committee had initiated a review of Clerk Dara Kessler. Charges: unauthorized disclosure of confidential compliance materials, failure to observe standard reporting protocols, and conduct inconsistent with the obligations of a Secretariat employee during the integration period. The hearing was scheduled for the following morning. Hearing Room 6. Governance level, 1 floor below the plenary hall. Tiered seating for 200 observers. A witness stand designed to make the person occupying it feel precisely as small as the institution intended. Dara received the summons at her desk. She read it. She placed it face down beside her empty stew container. She picked up her personal data chip and put it in her jacket pocket, not because she needed it, but because 4 years of work was on it and she was not leaving it in an office the Secretariat could lock at any time. She walked to her quarters. She ate. She set an alarm for 06:00. She packed a bag with her personal data chip, her 11 handwritten notebooks, and the watch. If the hearing went badly and the Secretariat revoked her access, she would not be returning to her alcove. She would be escorted from the complex within the hour. She had seen it happen to a Tavrathi clerk 2 years earlier, a quiet removal for a minor filing violation, the desk cleared before the next shift arrived. She lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. She slept perhaps 2 hours of the 5 she had allocated. She was not calm. She had never been calm. People would later describe her demeanor as calm. It would become part of the institutional narrative, the composed human, the woman who did not raise her voice. Dara knew the truth. She had not been calm for approximately 3.5 years, not since the first reconciliation came back wrong and the system told her to stop looking. What she was, what she had been through all those years of late nights and stew containers and citation chains, was certain. Certainty and calm look the same from the outside. From the inside, they are not the same thing at all. She had dressed the same as every other morning. She had considered briefly whether the occasion warranted something different, a formal jacket perhaps, or the one pair of shoes she owned that were not flat-soled. She dismissed the thought. She was a compliance clerk attending a proceeding. The proceeding was about compliance. She would dress for compliance. She ate a stew packet in her quarters before leaving, the first meal she had finished in 3 days. The hearing began at 08:00. Hearing room 6 was built in the classical council-style pale stone walls rising to a glass dome that admitted the full morning light of the Ethai sun. The dome was smaller than the plenary chambers, but still large enough that the sky above felt wide and close, bright pale blue with thin clouds catching the light. Through the glass, Dara could see the upper structures of the orbital complex communication arrays, docking pylons. And beyond them, holding silent formation at a distance that placed them squarely in the dome's frame, 3 heavy human cruisers, dark gray hulls catching the morning sun. They had been there since before dawn. No one at the committee bench had mentioned them. No one would. The senior administrative committee occupied the elevated bench, 7 members, 5 species, behind a long desk of polished dark stone. Pren sat at the center, charcoal robes, silver thread at the shoulders, gray hands folded, dark eyes steady. The observer tiers held roughly 60 people's secretariat staff, junior delegates, clerks from adjacent divisions. Lace was in the 3rd row, posture rigid, eyes on the bench. She did not look at Dara. Dara walked to the witness stand. Same blazer, same flat shoes, same watch. She carried nothing. The ledger was already in the Article 112 record in a space the administrative committee could not reach. Hands on the rail, she waited. "Clerk Kessler," Pren said. Her voice carried the chamber's acoustics the way the chamber was designed to carry a voice from that bench effortlessly, with the weight of architecture behind it. "You are here to answer charges of unauthorized disclosure, procedural breach, and conduct unbecoming a Secretariat employee. Do you wish to make a statement?" Dara looked at Pren. She looked at the 6 other committee members. She looked at Lace in the 3rd row. She looked at the dome, the sky, the 3 cruisers. "No." A murmur in the tiers. Pren's expression held. "You do not wish to explain your actions." "I filed a compliance discrepancy through standard channels. The discrepancy was not resolved. I provided supporting documentation to a body with charter authority to investigate it. Those are facts on the record." The documentation was classified as confidential compliance material. The documentation consisted of primary banking records, which are not classified, and archive entries, which are public under Article 31. The ledger was assembled entirely from sources available to any employee with standard archive access. One Keithrani member spoke quietly to his neighbor. The Desari member's 4 arms shifted, upper arms drawing inward, lower arms gripping the desk edge. "The committee notes your position. We will review the specific charges." They reviewed the charges for 2 hours. Each read in full, discussed, open for questioning. Dara answered with the precision she brought to compliance reviews. She cited article numbers and procedural codes. She cited sections of the 847-page employee handbook she had read twice. She provided dates when asked. She confirmed her contact with Orthan was permitted under Section 22 of the handbook, which explicitly authorized Secretariat employees to provide documentation to charter-mandated oversight bodies. She confirmed her meeting with Pren and its outcome. They asked whether she had discussed the compliance matter with any member of the Terran delegation. No. You did not notify your own species' diplomatic representatives of a matter directly affecting their standing. They are not my representatives. They are the Terran delegation. I am a Secretariat employee. My reporting obligation runs to the Secretariat's compliance infrastructure, not to any delegation. Section 3, Paragraph 11 of the handbook is explicit on this point. The Tvrathi did not ask a follow-up. A brief silence. Then the Disari committee member who had spoken only twice during the entire proceeding, both times to request procedural clarifications, leaned forward. His dark bronze face was unreadable, but two of his forearms had moved to grip the edge of the bench, a posture Dara recognized from her years working alongside Disari staff as involuntary engagement, the body responding before the mind decided to. "Clerk Kessler," he said, his voice was deep and unhurried. "How long did this investigation take you?" "Approximately 4 years. And during that time, you continued to perform your regular duties at full capacity?" "I did. My quarterly review scores are on file." The Disari member looked at her for a long moment. He did not ask another question, but he did not look away either, and when the next committee member began speaking, his arms remained gripping the bench edge. At 10:00, the committee called a recess. Someone offered Dara water. She did not take it. She stood at the rail and waited. Through the dome, the sky was bright. The cruisers had not moved. At 10:30, the hearing resumed. The room had changed. Where 60 observers had sat that morning, now there were over 150. Junior delegates from 4 species filled the upper tiers. A senior Disari trade commissioner sat in the second row, 4 arms folded in the formal posture of official observation. 2 Keithrani outer system representatives occupied central seats. A retired Tvrathi, magistrate the kind who attended proceedings out of long habit, who knew the procedural handbook better than most sitting judges, had taken a seat in the 4th row, and was watching the bench with the expression of someone comparing what he saw against what the rules required. Terran delegation staffers, 7 or 8 of them, sat together in the top tier, with the rigid posture of people who had been told not to attend and had come anyway. 2 reporters from the Independent Press Service wore, recording badges openly on their collars. A Vethon observer Dara had never seen had taken a first-row seat, recording notes on a thin, translucent tablet. And in the back row, partially obscured by a structural column, Orthan, 4 arms folded, expression unreadable, watching the bench. Pren swept the tiers. She took inventory. Something moved behind her composure, not alarm, but the stillness of someone recalculating the weight of the room. The committee will continue with the 3rd charge. The 3rd charge, conduct unbecoming, broad enough to encompass anything the committee decided it encompassed. Penalty, immediate termination, credential revocation, 5-year ban from all council-affiliated facilities. A younger Tvrathi committee member pressed the questioning. He had the compressed body language of someone performing institutional severity for the tiers above. "You undertook this research outside your assigned duties." "The discrepancy fell within my assigned duties. Case 9914 GC is my responsibility. The compliance review is still active." "You could have accepted the reconciliation." "The reconciliation was wrong. The primary sources contradicted it." and you believed your judgment superior to the archive verification divisions. Dara looked at him. I believed the banking records were superior to the archive entry. When a secondary record contradicts a primary source, the primary source takes precedence. That is standard compliance methodology. It is taught in the first week of archival training. He did not ask another question. The Keith Ronnie member on the far end of the bench leaned forward. He was older than the others, his scaled skin a deep copper, his posture carrying the particular authority of someone who had served long enough to ask questions the younger members avoided. Clerk Kessler, in your professional assessment, was the discrepancy you identified the result of a procedural error or a deliberate act? The chamber went still. Pren's gray hands tightened on the desk surface. The question had not been scripted. The murmur in the observer tiers died. The reporters in the upper rows stopped writing. Dara looked at the Keith Ronnie member. She considered the question. She considered the 214 pages of documentation behind it, the 112 citation chains, the consistent pattern across every fund category and every year. I am a compliance clerk, she said. My professional scope is limited to whether the numbers match. The numbers do not match. The reason they do not match is a question for the audit. The Keith Ronnie member sat back. He glanced at Pren. Pren did not meet his eyes. At 11:15, a clerk from the Secretary General's office entered through the side door. She walked to the bench with the measured pace of institutional protocol and placed a sealed document in front of Pren. The clerk's expression was carefully neutral, the expression of someone who has read what they are delivering and wishes they had not. Pren broke the seal. She read the document. The change was not dramatic, it never was with Pren. But it was visible, a tightening of gray hands on the paper's edge, a fractional shift of the head, the particular stillness of an administrator absorbing information that restructures the landscape she has been governing. She passed the document to the member beside her. It traveled down the bench, committee member to committee member, each one reading, each one going still. By the time the seventh member set it down, every face at the elevated desk carried the same expression, a look that transcended species-specific body language, and registered as something universal, variations on a single recognition that Dara, who had spent 4 years learning to read alien body language in windowless offices, identified immediately. It was the expression of people discovering that they are sitting on the wrong side of the proceeding. The Committee for Administrative Transparency had completed its preliminary findings under the Article 112 audit. Systematic discrepancies confirmed between Terran contribution records and official archive entries, every fund category, every year of the integration period. Total confirmed discrepancy, 347 million standard credits, slightly higher than Dara's estimate, because the audit team had accessed 3 allocation categories she had lacked clearance to reach. The findings had been entered into the plenary record, permanent, irreversible, part of the Council's institutional documentation in a way that could not be reclassified, amended, or quietly archived. Pren set her hands flat on the desk. She looked at the document. She looked at the tiers, the delegates, the reporters, the Terran staffers who had been told not to come, Orthan in the back row who had voted to invoke a power that had never been used. She looked at Dara. The morning light through the dome had shifted as the Ethai sun tracked across the sky. The pale shafts now fell directly across the committee bench, illuminating Pren's charcoal robes and gray hands and the polished stone surface of the desk she had governed from for decades. Above the bench, through the glass dome, the 3 human cruisers held their position against the bright sky. Their hulls caught the shifted light differently, now sharper, more defined, the angles of their armored plating visible in the clean morning air. They had not moved. They would not need to. The chamber was quiet. 150 people, 5 species, holding a silence that had the density of something compressed. The climate systems hummed. The holographic displays along the walls glowed their steady cyan. Somewhere in the upper tier, a chair creaked as someone shifted weight. That was the only sound for 8 seconds. Dara counted them. Her watch was good for that. "The committee will recess," Pren said. Her voice was even, controlled, the voice of an administrator performing administration. "For how long?" the Keithrani member asked. Pren looked at Dara. Dara looked back. 4 years between them. 4 years of filed discrepancies and denied appeals and a compliance ledger that was supposed to be 3 pages and had grown to 214. 4 years of stew containers and citation chains, and a watch that counted seconds. 4 years of a system telling her the numbers were right when the numbers were wrong, and a clerk who kept counting anyway. Dara said nothing. There was nothing to say. The record said it all, and the record was now permanent. "Indefinitely," Pren said. The committee rose. The observer tiers did not empty. People stayed standing, murmuring, some still seated. The sound of it rose in the bright chamber like pressure finding its level. The particular noise of an institution, beginning to understand that it has been heard by the mechanism it built to hear itself. Dara stepped down from the witness stand. She walked toward the exit. She did not hurry. She did not smile. She did not pause to make a statement to the delegates gathered near the doors, who watched her pass with expressions she could not quite categorize, something between recognition and the particular unease of standing near a shift you did not anticipate and do not yet know how to measure. A Keithrani delegate, one of the outer system representatives who had issued a statement of support, stepped forward as she passed. He did not speak. He inclined his head, a gesture Dara recognized from the protocol manuals as the Keithrani acknowledgement of a debt witnessed. She inclined her head in return and kept walking. At the door she passed Orthan. He was leaning against the corridor wall, upper arms crossed, lower arms hanging loose. His expression had settled into something readable, not triumph, not relief, but the slow, disarray blink of a large thing processed and found to be real. "The integration review," he said quietly. "It is going to be interesting." Dara stopped. She looked at him. She thought about the compliance ledger that was supposed to be 3 pages. She thought about the filing annex and the adhesive smell and the stew containers 3 per day at the end. 2 she bought and 1 lace left, and the 16-hour days and the 11,000-page charter and Article 112, which had waited for centuries and had finally been used. She thought about the portrait of Pren in the corridor, which she had walked past every morning for 4 years without slowing down. She thought about case 9914 GC, still technically open on her desk, still technically awaiting resolution of the discrepancy between an archive entry of 2.1 million and a banking record of 4.7 million. "It is going to be accurate," she said. She walked out into the main corridor of the governance level. Wide, bright, pale stone and brushed alloy. Daylight from the central dome poured through overhead glass. Staff moved in both directions, some glancing at her, most occupied with the ordinary business of an institution that had just been informed, through the mechanism of its own charter, that its records were wrong, and that the wrongness was structural and deliberate and now part of the permanent file. She took the lift to the administrative level. She walked the long corridor past the committee offices, past the supply rooms, past the portrait of Senior Administrator Pren still hanging, still lit, the composed gray face still radiating institutional confidence into the empty corridor. Dara did not slow down. Portraits did not appear in compliance ledgers. She walked into the office of archival compliance. Past the empty Tvrathi desks, past Lace's desk where the paper ledger sat squared at the corner and the pen lay beside it at its precise angle, to her alcove. She sat down. The climate duct hummed. The filing annex smelled of adhesive. The walls were bare. Her terminal showed the day's queue, 4 compliance reviews, routine matters, citation chains to verify, numbers that either matched or they did not. Dara Kessler opened the first file and went back to work.